Adam here, and there are a couple of pretty significant shifts happening across Greater Brisbane right now, some of them quite immediate and others that are going to shape the region for years to come. We're starting to see clearer directions around the 2032 Olympics, including what's being prioritised and what's no longer on the table. There are new attempts to unlock housing supply, which could have a real impact on affordability if they actually work as intended, and at the same time there are a number of local projects starting to be delivered on the ground, which gives a bit of insight into how all of this is translating into real outcomes. So rather than just running through a list of updates, I want to step back and look at where things currently stand across Greater Brisbane, what's locked in and what's still changing, and where the direction of travel seems to be heading. This video is sponsored by YB Painting and Excel Psychology, more on those later. Let's start with the Olympics because we've had a pretty significant update, not just in terms of announcements, but actual detail around the key venues people have been waiting on for quite some time. And a big one here is the main stadium. For a long time, the conversation around Brisbane's Olympic Stadium has been fairly abstract, whether it would be built, where it would go, and what form it would take. Now we're starting to get some concrete answers. The new Brisbane Stadium at Victoria Park is now expected to cost between $3.6 and $3.8 billion, with the capacity of roughly 63,000 seats in Legacy mode and 60,000 in Games mode. It's set to host athletics, the opening and closing ceremonies, and then transition after the Games into Brisbane's main AFL and cricket venue, with the Gabba effectively reaching the end of its life and set to be demolished after 2032. In terms of location, it's now been confirmed the stadium will sit in a central position near Gilchrist Avenue, embedded into the existing topography of Victoria Park. And that embedded part is quite literal. The design involves sinking the stadium into the landscape, using the natural hills to help shape the venue and even enhance acoustics, essentially trying to recreate the kind of enclosed high-pressure atmosphere you get at places like Suncorp Stadium. The field itself will be MCG-sized, with an east-west orientation based on wind, sun and long-term use for AFL and cricket. And from the renders, what we're seeing is 3 main tiers of seating, additional corporate levels, a halo-style video board around the roof, open ends to allow airflow, and shaded seating designed for Brisbane's climate. So this is no longer just a concept. We now have a fairly detailed picture of what's being proposed. We also have a much clearer timeline. Preparation works are set to begin on the 1st of June, once the site is handed over to the Games Authority. And from that point, Victoria Park will effectively become a construction site and is expected to be closed to the public through to 2032. So this is a pretty major shift, not just in planning terms, but in how that space is used for the next few years. Alongside the stadium, we've also seen movement on the Brisbane Arena. This will be a 17,000-seat indoor venue at Woolloongabba, forming part of a much larger entertainment and housing precinct. Right now, 2 major consortia have been shortlisted to deliver the project, with a final decision expected later this year. Construction is currently expected to begin in 2027, with completion targeted for 2031, which would allow it to be used during the Games. In the meantime, early site works are already underway, and geotechnical drilling has started. Importantly, this isn't just an Olympic venue. The broader plan includes a major entertainment hub and thousands of new homes as part of a mixed-use precinct around the Gabba. So this is one of those projects where the Olympic legacy is really being built into the design from the start. At the same time, though, there are some broader policy settings that will influence what that housing actually looks like. The Queensland Government has recently moved to remove certain affordable housing requirements from developments as part of a push to increase overall supply. So while projects like this could deliver a significant number of new homes, there's still an open question around how much of that will be genuinely affordable versus market rate or luxury housing. So while the stadium and arena projects are becoming more defined, not everything is locked in. Rowing is a good example of that. The current plan is for the event to be held on the Fitzroy River in Rockhampton, but there are still questions around that decision. A feasibility report has found the river would need to be widened and dredged to meet Olympic standards, with some estimates suggesting costs could run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. At the same time, some athletes have pushed for the event to be moved closer to southeast Queensland, while the state government has been very firm in keeping it in Rockhampton. So even now, parts of the Olympic plan are still being debated. Alongside all of that, there's also been a shift in the broader direction of the Games. When Brisbane was first awarded the Olympics, there was a strong emphasis on sustainability, including a commitment for the Games to be climate positive. That commitment is no longer part of the plan, with all emissions targets being dropped completely from the plan. That puts Brisbane on a slightly different path compared to other Olympic host cities. Recent games have generally moved in the opposite direction, with a strong focus on reducing emissions. Paris, for example, set a target to reduce emissions by more than 50% compared to previous games. And Los Angeles is aiming to go even further. Their plan includes what's been described as a largely no-car games, with spectators expected to rely heavily on public transport to get to events, alongside additional emissions reductions on top of what Paris targeted. So in that context, Brisbane stands out a bit. Rather than focusing on emissions targets or sustainability benchmarks, the priority here is much more clearly on delivering the infrastructure, managing costs, and making sure everything is ready on time. So what we're seeing overall is a pretty clear trade-off emerging. On one hand, more certainty around key venues, a stronger focus on delivery, and actual progress starting on the ground. But on the other, some major decisions are still being contested, earlier commitments have been dropped, and there are ongoing questions around cost and long-term legacy. So if you step back and look at where things currently stand, the main stadium is now clearly defined in terms of cost, design, and timeline. The Brisbane Arena is progressing, with construction likely to begin in 2027. Some events, like rowing, are still being debated, and the overall priority is now very clearly on getting the infrastructure built and delivered on time. And that same focus on delivery, getting projects moving, reducing delays, and trying to keep costs under control isn't just happening with Olympic infrastructure. We're starting to see a very similar approach when it comes to housing, because right now one of the biggest issues facing southeast Queensland is housing. We've seen strong population growth, ongoing pressure on rental markets, and affordability challenges for both buyers and renters, and the data really reinforces that. Brisbane home prices have now hit a new peak, with the average home sitting at just over $1 million, and prices up around 15 to 16% over the past year. At the same time, stock levels remain very tight, which is keeping competition high and putting a floor under prices. And it's not just houses. Unit prices have actually grown even faster, up more than 20% over the past year, partly because buyers are being pushed into more affordable options as house prices climb. So what you're seeing here is a market where demand is strong, supply is constrained, and affordability is becoming more and more of a limiting factor. And that's before you even get to the rental side. There are also warnings that rents could continue to rise, particularly with an ongoing shortage of new apartments coming online. So across both buying and renting, the underlying issue is the same. There simply aren't enough homes being delivered quickly enough to keep up with demand. So in response to that, the Queensland Government has made changes to what's known as the State Facilitated Development, or SFD, pathway. This is essentially a planning mechanism designed to fast-track certain developments, particularly housing. Under the updated rules, a broader range of residential developments can now access the pathway. Projects need to align with zoning or be able to be serviced by infrastructure, and importantly, they now require support from the relevant local council before proceeding. So compared to the previous version of this pathway, which was criticised for bypassing local decision-making, the new approach is trying to bring local councils back into the process. The goal here is fairly clear. It's about reducing delays, cutting red tape, and making it easier to get housing projects approved and built, because some of the key drivers of cost in housing aren't just construction, they're also time, uncertainty, and the complexity of the approvals process. So by streamlining that, the idea is that more homes can be delivered more quickly. But alongside those changes, there's also been a shift in how affordability is being approached. As part of the broader planning reset, previous affordable housing requirements have been removed, which means developers are no longer required to include a set proportion of affordable dwellings within these projects. So instead of mandating a certain level of affordable housing, the focus has shifted more toward increasing overall supply, with the expectation that this will help ease pressure on prices. And that's where the trade-off comes in. On one hand, removing those requirements can make projects more viable, reduce costs, and potentially speed up delivery. But on the other hand, it means there's no longer a direct mechanism within these projects to guarantee affordable housing outcomes. So while supply may increase, the question remains around how much of that supply will actually be accessible to lower and middle income households. And you can already see how these pressures are playing out in real life. There's a growing trend in Brisbane toward what's being described as improve, not move, because moving house has become so expensive. In some cases, it can cost upwards of $80,000 just to sell and buy, once you factor in things like stamp duty, agent fees, and moving costs. So instead of upgrading by moving, more people are choosing to renovate, extend, or repurpose the homes they already have. That includes things like raising houses to add another level, converting garages into short-term accommodation, or renovating to make better use of existing space. And that tells you something important. It's not just that housing is expensive, it's that even moving within the market has become a major financial barrier. So if you step back and look at where things currently stand with housing, there's clearly strong demand, limited supply, and rising prices. There's a policy push to increase supply and speed up approvals, but at the same time, affordability mechanisms have been scaled back. And on the ground, people are already adapting by staying put and trying to make their existing homes work. So while we may start to see more homes being delivered, the key question is not just how many homes are built, but what kind of housing is being delivered and who it's actually accessible to. If you already have your own place and you're thinking about making it look its best, I've got an offer from YB Painting for viewers of the channel. They recently picked up 2 first place and 3 second place awards at the Master Painters Australia Queensland Awards for 2025, which gives you an idea of the standard they're working at. They offer fixed pricing and a 5-year warranty on their work, so you know exactly what you're getting up front. You can claim an exclusive 10% discount by scanning the QR code on screen or through the link in the video description. While housing is one of the biggest long-term challenges, there are also some more immediate day-to-day issues affecting how the region functions, particularly when it comes to transport. One of the most notable right now is the Story Bridge. Routine maintenance works are scheduled over the Easter school holidays, and they're going to have a pretty noticeable impact on traffic. From April the 2nd through to April 13th, there will be a mix of lane closures and full closures at different times, including a full shutdown overnight into the morning on Sunday, April 12th. During that period, traffic will be diverted to other crossings like the Captain Cook Bridge and the Clem 7 Tunnel, with tolls on the Clem 7 temporarily waived for part of that closure window. Now, on one level, this is fairly routine maintenance, but the timing of this one does create a bit of a perfect storm, because at the same time, as I mentioned in a previous video, there are also major rail disruptions planned across multiple lines, including suspensions on the Beenleigh, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast lines, along with timetable changes and disruptions across several others. And on top of that, the Tour de Brisbane cycling event is set to close a number of inner-city roads on the Sunday morning, including parts of Bowen Hills, Fortitude Valley and Hamilton. So for that weekend in particular, a lot of the usual alternative routes, both road and rail, are either limited or unavailable. Which means even though each of these events on their own might be manageable, when they all happen at the same time, it's likely to put quite a bit of pressure on the transport network. So if you're planning to travel that weekend, it's probably one where you'll want to allow extra time or look at alternative options. But zooming out a bit, this does highlight something broader. The Story Bridge is now more than 80 years old and it carries over 100,000 vehicles a day. including a significant number of trips coming from outside the Brisbane local government area. So keeping it operational isn't just about convenience, it's critical to how the city functions. And what we're seeing here is part of a longer-term effort to maintain and extend the life of that infrastructure. There's already been more than $80 million invested in restoration works since 2019, and a longer-term plan is being developed for ongoing upgrades over the coming decades. So while short-term disruptions like this can be frustrating, they're part of a much bigger picture around maintaining key transport links as the city continues to grow. And it's not just Brisbane itself. In Ipswich, for example, strengthening works are underway on the Bremer River Bridge, which is another important connection in the region. These kinds of projects don't always get a lot of attention, but they play a key role in making sure the broader transport network keeps functioning as demand increases. So if you step back and look at where things currently stand, there's a clear focus on maintaining and upgrading existing infrastructure rather than just building new projects. And as the region grows, that balance between expanding the network and maintaining what's already there is only going to become more important. And from transport, we can shift into another area where policy and day-to-day behaviour are both starting to change, and that's around safety. Safety is another area where we're seeing a fairly clear policy shift right now, and it's happening on two different fronts. The first is e-mobility, particularly e-scooters and e-bikes. The Queensland Government has accepted in principle all 28 recommendations from the Parliamentary Inquiry into e-mobility safety and use, and the reforms being flagged are significant. They include restricting e-mobility devices to people aged over 16, requiring riders to hold a valid licence, introducing lower speed limits of 10 km an hour on footpaths and 25 km an hour unassisted, and giving police stronger powers to crack down on illegal and high-powered devices. That would include powers to seize and destroy illegal devices, random breath testing for riders, and tougher action against retailers selling non-compliant products. So this is not just a minor rules tweak. It's a fairly major tightening of the framework around how these devices are used in Queensland. And the government is framing that as a response to rising safety concerns, with more than 6,000 e-scooter-related injuries reported at emergency departments across 36 Queensland hospitals between 2022 and 2025. So the basic argument from the government is that the system was too loose, enforcement wasn't strong enough, and the result was an increase in injuries and unsafe behaviour. Whether all of these measures are proportionate is something people will no doubt debate, especially when you get into questions like licence requirements and the practicality of enforcement. But in terms of direction, it's pretty clear. The state is moving toward a much more tightly regulated model for e-mobility use, and you can already see that emphasis on enforcement at a local level. In Logan, for example, police have been running e-mobility safety operations, which fits into that broader push to crack down on unsafe riding and illegal devices. But what's interesting is that this tougher enforcement approach is happening alongside a very different kind of safety policy in another area, youth crime. At the same time as the government is talking about stronger laws and tougher responses, it has also announced 4 new early intervention programs across Greater Brisbane under its Kickstarter grants. These programs are aimed at young people who are showing early signs of disengagement, antisocial behaviour, or emerging criminal behaviour, with the idea being to intervene before those patterns become more serious and more entrenched. And the programs themselves are quite varied. In the Redlands, there's a bike building and mentoring program for at-risk youth aged 10 to 15. In Brisbane, there's a music therapy project for neurodivergent young people aimed at improving emotional regulation and reducing the risk of criminal behaviour. In Deception Bay, there's a 12-week mentoring and family support program for children aged 8 to 12 showing early signs of antisocial behaviour. And in Inala, there's a broader mentoring and community engagement program for young people aged 8 to 17. So if you step back and look at the bigger picture, what we're seeing is a 2-track safety approach. On one side, there's stronger enforcement, tighter rules, and more visible penalties. And on the other, there's early intervention, mentoring, and rehabilitation aimed at preventing problems before they escalate. And in a sense, that reflects a broader theme running through a lot of policy right now. The government is trying to show that it's being tougher where it thinks systems have become too loose, while also investing in programs that try to reduce longer-term harm. Whether that balance is right is something viewers will definitely have their own views on. But in terms of where things stand right now, the overall direction is pretty clear. Safety policy in Queensland is becoming both more interventionist and more hands-on, whether that's through stricter regulation of e-mobility devices or earlier attempts to redirect young people before they end up deeper in the justice system. And while that's one kind of response to the pressures of a growing region, it also highlights how important early support can be. And while we're on that topic, if you're looking for support with things like anxiety, depression, stress, ADHD, or relationship challenges, the other sponsor of this video, Excel Psychology, may be worth a look. They're a warm and inclusive psychology practice based in Spring Hill, just a short walk from Central Station. They've got a diverse team of clinical and registered psychologists, and they focus on matching you with the right person for your needs, often with relatively short wait times. They also offer Medicare rebates with a mental health treatment plan and have support for WorkCover and NDIS participants. If you'd like to find out more, you can scan the QR code on screen or check out the link in the video description. While a lot of the bigger conversations are happening at policy level, there are also a number of projects that are actually being delivered on the ground right now. And this is where you start to see how some of those broader plans are translating into real tangible outcomes. One example of that is in Logan, where a new Olympic-sized pool has just opened at the Beanley Aquatic Centre. This is a 50-metre 8-lane pool, part of a roughly $25 million redevelopment, and it's now one of only 2 Olympic-sized pools in the city of Logan. But what's interesting about projects like this is that they're not just about elite sport. Yes, there's obviously a connection to the 2032 Olympics and building a pipeline for future athletes, but the facility itself is designed for everyday use. It includes things like a children's water play area, shaded seating, barbecues, upgraded amenities, and accessible features, so it's just as much about community use as it is about high-performance sport. And that's really where the legacy argument comes in. Because while the big Olympic venues tend to dominate the headlines, it's often these smaller local projects that end up being used the most over time. We're also seeing that same idea play out in Moreton Bay. Plans are progressing around the Moreton Bay Central Precinct, which is set to include a new TAFE campus focused on training and skills development. And that's quite significant because it's not just about building infrastructure, it's about building capacity. Having a major TAFE presence in that precinct means more local access to education and training, a stronger pipeline into local jobs, and a closer link between growth areas and workforce development. So this is one of those projects where the long-term impact is less about the building itself and more about what it enables. And then in Brisbane, you've got something like the Princess Alexandra Hospital, which continues to expand as one of the region's key health hubs. And it's not just about size, it's about capability. The PA Hospital's stroke unit, for example, has received international recognition, picking up multiple awards through the World Stroke Organization's Angels Awards program. Across 2025, the team was recognised in every single quarter, securing 2 platinum and 2 gold awards. It's the only hospital in Queensland to reach that level. And that's significant because when it comes to stroke treatment, speed and quality of care can make a huge difference to outcomes. So when you look at investment and upgrades in that context, it's not just infrastructure for the sake of it. It's directly tied into the quality and performance of healthcare across the region. And alongside those larger projects, there are also smaller, less visible ones happening as well. Things like improvements to waste facilities and programs targeting issues like illegal dumping. They don't tend to get much attention in the news, but they do play a role in how the city functions day to day. So if you step back and look at where things currently stand, there's a mix of large-scale planning and smaller-scale delivery happening at the same time. And while the big projects tend to get most of the focus, it's these local upgrades that people often interact with most directly. And just quickly, if you've been finding these updates helpful and you'd like to support the channel, there are a couple of ways you can do that. You can support through Buy Me a Coffee or become a channel member here on YouTube, which also gets you access to extra content. There's absolutely no pressure, but it really does help support the time that goes into researching and putting together these updates every week. When you zoom out a bit, all of this activity, Olympics infrastructure, housing policy changes, and local projects, sits within a much bigger economic picture. Because Brisbane and southeast Queensland are still growing quite rapidly. We're seeing strong population growth, ongoing demand for housing, and continued investment across both the public and private sectors. And that growth is really what's driving a lot of what we've been talking about in this video. It's why there's pressure to build more homes. It's why major infrastructure projects are being prioritised. And it's why there's such a strong focus right now on actually delivering projects rather than just planning them. At the same time, though, there are some signs that things may be starting to shift slightly. While prices are still rising, there are indications that the pace of growth may begin to slow, partly due to affordability constraints and broader economic conditions. So what we may start to see is a market that remains tight but becomes a bit more uneven. Strong demand is still there, but it's being held back by things like borrowing capacity, cost of living pressures, and general uncertainty. And that creates an interesting dynamic because on one hand, there's still a need for more housing and infrastructure to support growth. But on the other hand, the capacity of people to actually participate in that market is becoming more constrained. And that tension is likely to shape how the region develops over the next few years. It also helps explain some of the behavioural changes we're seeing. People choosing to renovate instead of moving, buyers shifting towards units instead of houses, and increased investor activity in certain parts of the market. All of these are responses to the same underlying conditions. So if you step back and look at where things currently stand, the overall picture is one of strong growth, but growing constraints. There's still momentum in the system, but there are also limits starting to emerge around affordability, capacity, and how quickly things can realistically be delivered. And that's really the balancing act the region is facing right now. How do you continue to support growth while also making sure the growth remains sustainable and accessible? And that raises a slightly bigger question, because most of the time when we talk about these issues, we're focused on how Brisbane responds to population growth, but we don't often stop and look at the growth itself. What's actually driving it? How much of it is coming from interstate migration, international migration, or natural increase? And more importantly, is the current level of growth something that's necessary, manageable, or something that needs to be adjusted? There are a lot of strong views on that at the moment, but not always a lot of detailed evidence-based discussion. So that's something I'm thinking of exploring in a future video, really breaking down what's driving population growth in Greater Brisbane and what the implications actually are. If that's something you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. But for now, I want to come back to where things stand today, because there are a few trade-offs here that are worth unpacking a bit further. Now, before I get into this, just a quick reminder, we've now moved into the My 2 Cents segment, where I step back from the neutral reporting and share a bit more of my own perspective in the hope of triggering a discussion where people share their own thoughts on the matter in the comments section. My own biases will certainly come out, but I also want to make clear that I'm not putting down anyone with a different set of values or priorities to my own. If anything, I'd love to hear your side, as this is all about trying to look at things from multiple perspectives. And this week, I want to focus on housing, because there's a pretty important question sitting underneath everything we've talked about. Does building more housing actually make housing more affordable? Because right now, there's a very strong push to increase supply. We're seeing planning pathways being streamlined, red tape being reduced, and a general focus on getting more homes built more quickly. And on paper, that makes sense. If you increase supply, that should help bring prices down or at least slow their growth. But when you look at what's actually happening, it seems it's not so straightforward. Prices are still high, rents are still under pressure, and affordability is still a major concern. So it raises the question, not just about how much housing is being built, but what kind of housing is being delivered and who is actually building it. Because most of that supply is being delivered by private developers, and their role in the system is pretty clear. They take on risk, they fund projects, and they deliver housing, but ultimately they're profit-driven. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not a criticism, that's just how the system is set up. But it does shape approaches and outcomes. Because what gets built is naturally going to be influenced by what is financially viable rather than what might be most needed from a social perspective. And that becomes more relevant when you look at recent policy changes. With the removal of affordable housing requirements, there's now less of a direct mechanism to ensure that new developments include lower cost housing. So instead of mandating a certain level of affordable housing, the focus has shifted more towards increasing overall supply with the expectation that this will improve affordability over time. And that could work, but it might not work. Because supply on its own doesn't necessarily mean affordability, especially if that supply is concentrated in certain types of housing or certain price points. And this is something I touched on in a previous video where I asked whether Brisbane is becoming unaffordable. Because if the people building the housing are primarily responding to market signals, then the question becomes whether the market alone can deliver the kind of affordability outcomes people are looking for or even need. And then there's the political side of this. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where things can quickly become more about perception than fact, but it is something that comes up quite a lot in discussions across the community. There's a view held by some residents that governments, particularly those taking a more development-focused approach, may be prioritising growth and delivery over things like affordability or social impacts. Now in Queensland, the LNP is currently in power at the state level, and Brisbane City Council is also controlled by an LNP majority. Historically, that party has often been associated with a more development-friendly approach, although it's worth noting that different governments, regardless of party, can take similar positions depending on the circumstances. And while Redland City Council is officially non-partisan, some councillors are often seen as aligned with similar policy approaches, particularly when it comes to development. Now again, that doesn't automatically mean their decisions are wrong. There are valid arguments that encouraging development increases supply, supports economic growth, and helps meet demand in a growing region. But what we're seeing are a number of policy decisions that lean in that direction. Things like the removal of affordable housing requirements in the state-facilitated development rules, or resistance to mandating affordability targets in some local planning frameworks. And depending on your perspective, those decisions can be seen in different ways. Some would argue they're necessary to get more housing built and reduce barriers to development. Others would argue they reduce the ability to directly influence affordability outcomes. While we can all agree that building more homes is important, the real question is, who is the system ultimately designed to benefit? Is it primarily about increasing the number of homes as quickly as possible, or is it about ensuring those homes are accessible to a broader range of people? Because ideally it would be both. But in practice, there's always trade-offs, and which aspects take priority will often come down to different values or priorities rather than something that has a single clear answer. And I think that's the part of the conversation that's often missing. It's not just about whether we build more housing, it's about what kind of housing we build, where we build it, who is building it, and who it actually ends up serving. If you want to go deeper into that question around whether Brisbane is actually becoming unaffordable, I've broken that down in the video here. See you there. And that same focus